My name is Jim, with two M's, Larry Hendren. I was born in Gravette, Arkansas, June 11, 1940, and born at home. I didn't have hospital facilities available at that time. My mother was attended by a midwife, and so I began life in Benton County, and I've pretty much been here ever since, except for a few times that I've been away in the service and other things.
Thank you. So who were your parents? Tell me about your parents. Who were they and what were they like?
My dad was Nick Hendren, Nick N. Hendren, and he was born also in Benton County on October the 25th, 1903, and he lived until 1996. He died November 12th, 1996, and he's 93 at the time. My mother was also born in Benton County. She was born at Centerton, July the 23rd of 1906. And she and Dad got married, August the 30th of 1924. And they lived together one day short of 60 years. She died August the 29th of 1984. She's 78 at the time. So they both born and raised their families here in Benton County, and in turn their families had been here in Benton County since shortly before the Civil War. And Dad's family came here in about 1858, something like that. Mother's family, the Fair family, also came to Benton County in about that same time. We're doing this interview in a log house that my great-grandfather would be my dad's grandfather, Captain William Hicks Hendren, helped build in 1868, right after the Civil War. This is the Captain Hendren log house that we're sitting in now. Just over the hill, here on the other side of the house, Scott, there's another cabin, the Ellis Fair log cabin, I call it. It was built by my great-great-grandfather, Ellis Fair, right before the Civil War. He and 5 of his sons built it over by Gravette. And my mother is a descendant of Ellis Fair. That lineage, Ellis Fair was the great-great-grandfather to me. One of his sons was Joseph Asbury Fair, who was a Methodist preacher at Centerton for many, many years. One of his sons was Hugh Lanson Fair, who was my grandfather. And one of Hugh's children was my mother, Luella Fair Hendren. So both sides of the family have been in Benton County since before the Civil War.
So what was life in Benton County like when that log cabin was built? I mean, how hard would that have been to build it, and what was life like back then?
Well, as you know, Scott, the only thing I will know about that is what I have been told, but I do have quite a lot of information that was supplied by my grandfather, Hugh Lanson Fair. He was a justice of the peace and carpenter, and a very well-read man. He had excellent handwriting, and he wrote a lot of articles that were published in the Gravette News Herald many years ago about the early history of Gravette. So I draw my information about how things were back then mainly from Grandpa Fair, because he was a prolific writer. Among other things, he was a Mason, and the lodge, Bethel Lodge 232, I think it was originally founded in Nebo Valley over next to Gravette. And according to Grandpa Fair and others, there was a whiskey distillery in Nebo. We call it Old Town over next to Gravette right now. It's just east of Gravette toward Bentonville. But according to what I learned from him, it was pretty primitive. There was not a lot of nice houses. There were some, like the Peel Mansion here, I think was extant at that time. But it wasn't uncommon for folks to live in log structures. Certainly it wasn't uncommon for our families. we poor people. My people were poor people, and I'm proud of that. I even wrote a story about that one time, about a song actually, that my dad raised me on a nickel, 2 pennies, and a dime, and a 2-room house, raised 4 kids. That's all they had at the time. And back then, when Dad was growing up, they got married in 1924 when he was not quite 21 yet. And at that time, he worked for $1 a day and worked a 10-hour day to make $1. That's 10 cents an hour. And I don't know how it was done. Like I say in the lyrics to the song, I don't know how far poor people's money would go at that time, but it went far enough for him to raise a family on it. And I figured out, for me, that was about 17 cents, a nickel, 2 pennies, and a dime. The railroad came through Gravette, I think, in about 1898, I should say, or thereabouts. And that was quite a boon. It had been extended south from Sulphur Springs for many years. Sulphur Springs, Arkansas was the southern terminus of the Kansas City Railroad, but they extended it on through Gravette and on down south about that time. And I think Gravette was founded in 1898 or thereabouts. At that time, apples was a big crop here, and when you came in, you didn't notice it, I'm sure, but there's an old platform scale there. And my dad got his start as a cattleman by raising a bumper bean crop, green bean crop. He hit it just right and had an incredible yield, and sold the beans there at a plant there in Gravette. And as a result of that bean crop and the money he made on it, he was able to have enough money to buy the place that my brother Kim and I grew up at over Gravette. He was able to buy himself a new truck. He was able to have the funds to start his business raising cattle and dealing in cattle. And all those beans from that bumper crop were weighed up on that platform scales. He'd sack them up, I think, in 100-pound sacks and weigh them up before he took them in to sell them. But I ended up with that scale every time I walked past it. I think about how hard it was to, if you've ever picked beans, and maybe you have, that's not one of the things that caused me to decide I want to maybe get into the law. It's a little bit easier than picking beans, or strawberries for that matter. So it was a time whenever this was a country folks. You grew up, I'm sure, down around Lincoln and Prairie Grove, and it's pretty similar, I think, to how things were then. Not like it is now. There wasn't any Walmart, there wasn't any Peterson, there wasn't any Tysons. They're basically just farm folks, and it was a hard way. Yeah, just blow that out, yeah.
So tell me about your family, your siblings. What siblings do you have, and what were they like? Tell me about them.
Mother and Dad had a total of 6 children, 4 of whom lived to maturity. The firstborn was my oldest brother, Julian, and he was born in 1925, and he died in 2017. About 4 years ago. The second child was my sister, Marinelle Hendren, and she later married Earl Wills, and she unfortunately died very young, at the age of 46. She was born in 1926, and she died in 1973 from cancer-related illness. The third son was Evan Lanson Hendren. We called him E.L. He was called E.L. He was born in 1930, and he died of pneumonia in 1936. Sadly, because penicillin apparently was not available to the family at that time, I was always told that it probably would have saved his life if it had it. They just didn't. He died, and things, my mother and dad were so poor at that time, they really didn't have the money to even buy clothes to bury that boy in or pay for his funeral. So my uncle, one of my uncles, Uncle Bill from Marshall, Texas, sent them a blank check, and they used that to buy clothing to bury E.L. in and to buy his casket and so forth. The odd thing about that is I never knew that. I knew Uncle Bill well and favorably, and I have Captain Hendren's guns that my great-grandfather carried in the Civil War. Uncle Bill had them, and I got them through him. But he never said never said anything about that. I only learned that he had paid for that boy's funeral after he died. He died in 1974, and later his widow told me that Uncle Bill had provided that money, because that's how poor Mother and Dad were at that time. He never said a word about it to me. So he was an extraordinary guy. But anyway, that was the sad part about E.L. He was a favorite of my mother. She never got over his death. Even to the day she died, she never got over that. The fourth child was my brother Kim. He's born February 6, 1938. Of course, he's still around. He's 85 now, in amazing condition for somebody that age. And the fifth son was me. I was born, as I said, June 11, 1940. There was a sixth child that was born, a baby girl. She was named Ruth. And she was born on my mother's birthday in 1945 and stillborn. She did not survive. So she was born July the 23rd, 1945. And so that's the family as far as I know. And Kim and I are the only ones still around. Mattie Nell died in 1973 and Julian in 2017. And of course E.L. died, as I said, in 1936, and Ruth in 45.
So what was it like growing up? And you say Gravette, it was out in the country, probably, but...
We live a mile and a half east of Gravette on Highway 71. At that time, it's now Highway 72. And Kim owns that place now, and he's done a great job in keeping it up, so it looks better now than it did when we lived there. But it was an interesting situation. When we moved there in 1945, there was no indoor plumbing, there was no electricity. The water supply was a hand-dug well that had a hand pump on it that you had to go out and pump a bucket of water and then bring it in the house, and that was used for drinking and for cooking, and if you wanted a bath you had to pump out several buckets of water and fill up a tub and so forth. It was very primitive. And I remember when we got electricity, it was astonishing. It was amazing. Prior to that time, if you had light at night, it was a kerosene or coal oil lamp, and that doesn't provide a whole lot of light, or a fireplace. Boy, when that electricity came in, that was magic. We wore that light switch out. We turned that thing. It was a magic. You flipped that switch and instantly the entire room was full of light. You couldn't imagine that. And then Dad dug a septic tank and put in a septic tank, and we got indoor plumbing, and that was amazing. Prior to that, when you went to the bathroom, as we call it, you went out to the outhouse. And that had to be cleaned every now and then, which is not a very pleasant job. When we got the telephone, Dad and the neighbors worked together to build the line. They built the line from the Gravette Telephone Exchange out to our house and picked up the neighbors on the way. They put that telephone line up themselves. It's a party line. And I remember that when the phone would ring, everybody stopped to listen and count the rings. You know, I think our ring was 2 longs and a short, something like that, and others would be a long, a short, and a long, and people would listen, and then whoever identified with the number of rings would pick up, and almost invariably several others would pick up to start listening. And you may have watched Andy Griffith's show where the telephone operator call up and say, ring up so-and-so, and she'd say, well, they're not home, they went someplace. That's the sort of thing we had at Gravette. I remember going by the telephone exchange just north of the stoplight there in Gravette, and the ladies, all were females, telephone operators would be in there, and they would be connecting wires, to connect people to talk in the local exchange. And that was amazing to me as a child, and I really had an epiphany on it. I remembered it strongly when I was in Vietnam. I had a couple of sojourners or tours during the Vietnamese unpleasantness, but the second one I was in Da Nang. I was a military judge there and also the assistant staff legal officer in Da Nang, but at that time there was a telephone system in Vietnam, but it was even more primitive than was the telephone system in Gravette, Arkansas in the 1950s. And the time I'm talking about in Vietnam was 1969 and 70. And I remember one time I had business, something going on with the case that I was handling in Saigon, and I was up in Da Nang, and it's quite a distance. So I set up a telephone conference call with the 2 military lawyers that were in Saigon. And to set that up, you had to go through 17 local exchanges together to go to Saigon. And so we started out at about 7:30 that morning to the local exchange to go hook up down to Saigon. And I'd get maybe to the 3rd exchange, and the little Vietnamese girls were operating and barely could speak English. And they'd plug you in, but they'd get busy with something else. And next thing you know, when you get down to the 3rd or 4th station, somebody along the line would pull the plug inadvertently, and you're done. You have to start all over. We worked for 3 hours until about 10:30 that morning trying to get those 17 connections made so we could talk. I think one time we got down to about number 13 and somebody pulled the plug. It just was so frustrating. So I went out to 15th Airport and got on a C-130. I got a copy of one hanging in there. And I flew from Da Nang down to Saigon to have that conference call because we could not get the telephone service connected. And I thought at the time, that's the way it was back in Gravette at that time. You had to go through that local exchange, but it was far better than the Vietnamese did it. Now, with the cell phones, it's utterly amazing. But back in the day, making a telephone call in local was not that easy.
So tell me about, where'd you go to school and what was it like?
Went to Gravette High School, and it was a small school, but I think it was excellent. I had great teachers, had a great superintendent. It was a great school. The school building at the time when I started was made up of a single structure, the main building itself, and there was a lunchroom that had been built close to the main structure, and there were also a home economics building and a agricultural building and then a gymnasium. But the main classroom facility was a freestanding structure. The first 6 grades were on the first floor, and 7 through 12 were on the top floor. And so I attended the first 3 grades there on the first floor of that structure. And then beginning the 4th grade, a new elementary school was built to the east of that, with a band room facility, and there were 2 long structures. One held the 1st through 3 grades, and the second one 4 through 6. And so when I went into the 4th grade, I went to that new elementary school. And then when I got through that, 6th grade, I went back to the main structure, which then housed just grades 7 through 12. And that's where I finished there, grades 7 through 12. Had some great teachers. They were what would probably be called influencers now, because they took an interest in the students, not only in teaching them basics, but they really tried to assist them and encourage them to be the best that they could be. One of my best instructors was a man by the name of Joe McCall, and he taught us a lot. He taught me a lot in particular. Taught me how to play chess. Actually gave me the first chess set that I ever have, and I still have it. But Joe McCall said frequently, "Class, the purpose of education is not to teach you what to think, but how to think." I wonder what Joe McCall would say about it today if he were still with us. He'd be well over 100 years old now, so I'm sure he's not with us. But I've reflected on that saying a lot, and I actually wrote a poem based upon my association with Joe McCall. It goes like this. Once Joe McCall to me said, "You have a brain in your head to guide you along your life's way. But if you don't use it, I'm sorry to say, it might as well be just a gray lump of clay. So be sure that of you with that brain in your head, it never can truly be said that although you had it, you made it a habit to behave like you didn't instead." And that's true. He said many times, "Class, one of the worst things you can do is not think." One time he had asked me a question, it was in the physics class, and I gave, I guess, a fairly good answer. And one of my classmates, I won't say who because he's a good friend of mine now, but he wasn't paying attention, and Mr. McCall noticed that. And he said, well, called his name, said, "What do you think?" And he kind of woke up and said, "Well, I just think what Jim thinks." And McCall spent the next 15 minutes really going over that. Said that's the worst thing you can do is to just accept somebody else's opinion, no matter what you think of them and whether you think you're right. You need to think for yourself, analyze it yourself, and form your own opinions. Never have forgotten that, the encouragement that he gave to us. So, I don't know if I've answered your questions, but I would say this, that even though it was a very small school, I think I probably got as good or maybe better a high school education as anybody around at that time.
Good. So tell me, you mentioned earlier something about your family business. Your dad got involved in farming. Talk about how he got started in that and then what your part in it was.
Dad, when he and Mother got married in 1924, worked in the coal mines at Pitcher, Oklahoma. And he, at that time, was making probably $4 to $5 a day, which was really good money because outside the mines, most people were working for $1 a day, 10 cents an hour. But it bothered him because there's danger involved, and also it was, according to him, a very close-knit society of coal miners, and that if you stayed with it long enough, you probably never would leave. And a lot of people would get indebted to the company store, like the great song 16 Ton. And so he left and got out of that, and whenever he did, he started working for the railroad. He helped build that extension of the Kansas City Southern Line that I think I mentioned earlier, south from Sulphur Springs on past Gravette and so forth. And then after that, he was farming and raising bean crops and apples and so forth. But when he made that bean crop, he had enough money to get into what he truly loved and cared about, and that was livestock. and he would buy and sell cattle. And he eventually founded a sale barn there in Gravette livestock auction. And a few years later, he actually built his own auction barn out across the road from our house on a piece of property that he owned there. It's called the Ozark Auction Barn. And he worked in that. He got out and encouraged people to bring animals in that they had to sell, and he had buyers that bought for packing companies and so forth that would come in and make the sales go, as you would say. One of the amazing things about my dad, he was not an educated man, didn't have formal education. He was one of 12 surviving children of E.L. Hendren and his wife, Maddie. They had 15 children altogether, but 3 of them died in infancy. But Dad had a capability that I think was born of experience, because Grandpa Hendren, his father, lost an eye early on, and so Dad was the second oldest son, and he dropped out of school to kind of help around the home. They all had to work to just put food on the table and help. And so he finished, I think, maybe the 5th or 6th grade. He never went further than that. All went in a one-room school over around Gravette. But he was an amazing guy in many ways, because he worked as a ringman in his own sale barn, which means that he would be in the ring itself, and the auctioneer would be up on the bench, and when an animal would come into the ring and be offered for sale, there were 2 ways they would sell back then. One would be just by the head. Now these are figures from many years ago. They're much greater now, but say maybe the animal would be worth $125, $150. Nowadays you're talking about $1,000 or $1,500 for the same animal probably. But back then that was maybe the price. The other way to sell would be so much a pound, sell the animal by the pound. Now that's a little tricky, because in order to know how much that amounts to, you have to be able to guess, or pretty well guess, how much does that animal weigh, and then you have to multiply the price you're talking about by the number of pounds to get the value of the animal. Now, if you think of that through, that is a little bit complicated, but I saw him do it a number of times. He would be in the ring, an animal would come in, and his job was to set it in, to start the bidding. Many times somebody would just make a bid from the audience, but it was the ringman's job to get it started. Now, my dad's policy always was, when he made a bid, it was real. If nobody took him out and they knocked it off, he had to buy it. He would never, it wasn't a false bid, and everybody knew it. If Nick Hendren made that bid, it was real, and he never backed off from it. If he misguessed it, bid it too high, he'd take a beating on it. Here's what would happen. The animal would come in, for example, and the auctioneer would start to cry, okay, what am I going to get for this animal, and so forth. And Dad would look it over and so forth, and he'd say, $125. And maybe the bid would go on, and generally he wouldn't bid against his customers. He would set it in to get it started. But if nobody took him out, he bought it. Well, it was optional for the owner at that time, I don't know how it is now, that if the owner wasn't satisfied with the price they were getting, he could cancel the sale. He would PO it. I don't know exactly what PO meant, but it stops it. So then you could try to sell it by the pound if you wanted to. So when that happened, Dad's task then was to make a bid so much a pound. He would almost instantly say 15 cents or 16 cents, whatever it was. And then it would progress from there. Now, I saw this a number of times watching, that when he'd started the bid at $150, if it didn't sell at that price and they tried to sell it on a per pound basis, when he made the bid per pound like 15 cents, once that animal was weighed and you multiply the weight times his bid, it would be almost exactly what he had bid per head. Now, for that to happen, in the midst of all this going on in a sale ring and all the noise and so forth, he had to make an accurate guess that that cow is going to weigh, let's say, 1,000 pounds. And if I multiply 1,000 times 15, that's going to be $150, and that's about where I want to be. And he'd do that in his head. Never wrote anything down. He'd just be walking around and he'd do that in his head. And I asked him, I said, how do you do that? And he had his own system that he had figured out. He said, well, I figured that cow was going to weigh 1,000, say 1,200 pounds. And I figure, if the price were 10 cents a pound, 10 times it would be $120. Then you're going to, he had this figured out in his mind how he would do that calculation. He didn't have a calculator. There wasn't a calculator at that time. Never heard of one. There were adding machines and so forth. To this day, I never understand how he had the ability to do that, but he did. And he did it well because he was successful. So you might imagine I'm kind of proud of my dad. Now, I have a bit more education than he did. I can't do that. I wouldn't even try to do it. And I've always learned something from that. That education is great, and it can be very useful. You can gain a lot of information and experience based upon the experience of others who've actually done it. But it doesn't make you any smarter. It just gives you tools that may help you do things perhaps a bit easier. But my dad's experience and his talent showed me that there can be education in many different ways. If you look at that device that's hanging on the wall right over there, that's a drill press that my dad operated by hand, and that will drill through solid steel. It'll take you maybe an hour or two to get it done. But he knew how to do things like that. If his mowing machine broke, he couldn't go to Walmart or Tractor Supply and buy a part. He would make his own out of a piece of steel. He'd just make it. I've seen him do that a number of times. He could fix fence. He could dehorn cattle. He could castrate stock when it needed to be. He had so many talents. And when my brother and I both got college education, sometimes he was very, very critical. He said, boys, I bought you books and you still don't know how to do anything. He was right. We didn't know how to do a lot of things that he knew how to do. But he quarreled with me quite a bit. I loved to read when I was a young boy. And it seemed to enrage him when he caught me reading. He thought I ought to be up out taking care of the cattle and doing that. You're never going to amount to anything, just reading. And sometimes I'd like to say, well, Dad, I think reading has helped me out quite a little bit in my career, more than it would wrestling cattle.
So what was your part on the farm and in the sale barn?
Well, we're sitting in this cabin again. I refer back to that. And at the time I was growing up, this was part of a milk barn. There was sheds built around it. It was a superstructure of a cattle barn. And right here where this fireplace is, the fireplace was gone after it had been originally constructed. That was just an open space, and there were stanchions on the outside where we had feed box where the old cows had come in and put their head in the stanchions. Those are the stanchions right there. And so I put them up there to make a railing for this loft in this cabin. But the old cows would stick their head in there, and we'd come around here and feed them, and then we'd go around and milk them by hand. So that was my job. Kim and I, we milked cows, and we fed them hay. We helped clear land. We picked up rocks. Arkansas grows rocks. It used to back then, and you could pick them up, and then you go back a month later, and there's a whole new crop there. But we worked baling hay. We worked helped Dad put in crops. We helped him repair fences. We worked in the sale barn. Kim and I worked every time there was a sale. We would go out and help handle the cattle. Every morning, I can't remember ever sleeping past 8 o'clock in my lifetime up till I graduated high school, but twice. Once was when I was very sick, and after Kim and I got big enough to help, and the other time we were playing basketball in a state tournament and got to sleep late. Other than then, every morning, rain or shine, holiday, didn't matter what the day was, you got out of bed and you went out to do the chores. You got the cattle in, you milked them, you fed them, you took care of the milk and all the rest of that. Then you could get cleaned up and get dressed, you could have breakfast, and you catch the bus and go to school. Then when school is over, you don't stay around town and play pickup games or anything like that. You came home and you went out and you went through the same thing again. You milked those cows and you fed them and you took care of them. If they needed to be doctored, you did that. And after that was done, then you could clean up and have supper and maybe watch television. But we were so envious of the town kids. They didn't have to get up early. They didn't have to milk cows. I remember thinking, boy, if I ever get to where I don't have to get up every day and milk a cow, and I don't miss it.
So did that hard working on the farm guide your later career path, or talk about that, how you went from farm to legal business?
I think that's true. I think that all of us are influenced in a product for good or ill, some in a positive way, others not. Some friends of mine I knew that grew up in those circumstances, they wanted to stay on the farm, and I don't mean to say by what I'm saying there's anything dishonorable or wrong about being on the farm. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the fact that I had that experience, and I'm proud that we have folks that do that sort of thing. And the farmers and the dairymen in this country are vastly underappreciated. But let me answer this question you just asked me in this way, how it has influenced my later life and so forth. I, as you may know, served as a United States District Judge, an active federal judge for over 22 and a half years. I've been inactive now almost 9 years, I guess. Almost 9 years. So I'm still commissioned, but I don't hold court now, and I'm basically retired, but it's in an inactive status. But during that service, I used some of the stuff I learned as a farm boy milking cows over in Gravette. There was a case where this dairy farmer had gotten some bad feed, as I recall, and he lost his dairy herd. He was milking, as I recall, about 50 cows per day, and he had a contract with the milk company, either Kraft or Pet, I can't remember who, but he was obligated to have a milk supply each day that could be taken into the plant, could be homogenized and processed and then put in a grocery store so you could have milk for your cereal. So this guy had this problem with his feed, and he'd lost his dairy herd, and he was suing for damages. So he had a set of lawyers, and the milk company, or the company that supplied the bad feed, had a set of lawyers. And so there got to be a real racket started between the lawyers, and they were talking to me about it, and they said, now we got a real problem here. They said, this guy, the feed company lawyers are saying is suing us, claiming that we ought to pay for the loss of 150 cows. But he was only milking 50 cows. And now we need to get that straightened out right now. We want a motion in limine that he can't tell the jury that he has damages of losing 150 cows. And the plaintiff's lawyer was a little, he didn't quite know what to say about that. And I said, well, what say you? And he said, well, and he's hemming and hawing around. And I said, either of you guys raised on a farm? No. Why? I said, well, I don't think either one of you quite understand what has to happen here. I said, A cow does not give milk perpetually, day after day, year around. Do you not know that? A cow doesn't give milk until she has been bred or impregnated by a bull, has carried a fetus for 9 months, the same length of time that a human fetus is carried. And then the calf is born. She, as the farmer's cattlemen say, she comes into her milk. And very early on, it's very heavily cream, and very heavy in cream, because that's what feeds the baby calf. Well, then the baby calf nurses and uses that very potent milk, heavy with cream, until it's able to be weaned and go on regular food. Then the cow continues to supply milk for a certain length of time, and I said, I really don't know how long it is, but it's a certain finite period of time. And that's when that milk is sold to be processed and to be served in the milk that you drink every day from the grocery store. Now, in order to keep his business going around year round, that farmer has to have at least three sets of 50 cows. So when he's got this first 50 online, he's got to make sure the second 50 that's going to come online are bred, and that their baby will arrive about the time that these cows are drying up, getting out of their milk. And then he puts a second 50 online. And then he's got to have a third 50. And if you don't think that takes some pretty meticulous planning, because I've had to do it, where you make sure that bull gets in so he can do the breeding at the appropriate time. And I said, so it's very complicated, but you cannot possibly supply milk year round using just 50 cows, because they're going to provide milk for about a third of the year, maybe how long it is, but you got to have another bunch coming on. They had no idea what I was talking about. And until that point, I didn't realize how important that was. I mean, I just knew that, because that's what we did. We weren't in the dairy business. I mean, Dad was buying and selling cows, but we knew for sure that cow's not going to give milk year round. She's going to give milk during a certain time, and she's going to dry up. And she's not going to give any more milk until she's had another calf. Now, that's a long story, but that's what you asked me. That's just one example of how, growing up on the farm stood me in really good stead. And there were other examples, too, of things that I learned in the high school that I think were very beneficial to me. Dad used to say, son, to take care deal with a cow or any kind of animal, you got to be smarter than they are, because they're a lot bigger than you are. They weigh half a ton, some of them. They're a lot stronger than you are. You're not going to overpower them, so you have to outthink them and get them to do what you want them to do by fixing the gates a certain way, toting them with food and so forth. That's true of a lot of people. You can't force very many people to do things. I mean, as a judge, sometimes you can coerce folks to do things, but it's far better if you can convince them that it's in their best interest and yours and everybody else's to do a certain thing or not to do a certain thing. So I think I learned something by dealing with livestock that don't mean to insult anybody, but sometimes the same techniques work with people.
Let's talk about how you first got involved in politics. Start from the beginning and kind of walk me through it. Your public service.
Well, I don't really claim to be involved in politics. I was asked more than once, how does one get to be a federal judge? And I don't know how really to explain that. I've heard that question asked of other federal judges who've been around a lot longer than me, and generally their stock answer is always, it's clearly on merit. But that's sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing. It really isn't. It basically has to do with a political nomination and a political appointment. And so it's kind of a dichotomy, really, because I believe that once you are put in, especially a federal appointment, it's a lifetime appointment, that the time that happens, you take that oath, you must completely get out of politics, have nothing to do with it. And that's what I have done my best to do. Since I was appointed by George H.W. Bush, April the 15th, 1992, I believe that was the effective date, that's when I was sworn in. I've tried my best to stay completely out of politics. And during my 22 and a half years of service, I always said to my staff, anybody that worked with me, we do not get involved in politics at all. If your politics interfere with your judgment in helping me on a particular case, then you step away and somebody else will handle it. If my politics, however I feel about anything politically, is bothering me, I'll recuse. Let some other judge handle it. It's not right, it's not fair for me to introduce whatever my political thoughts might be into an issue that's between maybe people that are Republicans or Democrats or independent. It doesn't matter what their politics are. They're entitled to a fair trial by an unbiased judge. And if you can't be that way, you need to step aside. It's easy to do. You can recuse, and there are other judges who can come in and take the case. So I tried to do that and tried to stay out of politics after I was appointed. I wasn't strongly involved before I went on the bench, although I went to law school with David Pryor, who was a good friend of mine, still is till this day, and he's older now. We both are. Don't see him much anymore, but of course he was a Democrat. And I supported him strongly, and also Dale Bumpers. But there came a time before I went on the bench that I wasn't rabidly interested in politics anyway, and I felt like at one time that probably I was more aligned with a conservative and Republican view than I was a Democrat. And so I did change my registration and voted Republican, but I always remained friends with Pryor and Bumpers, and I know when I was nominated by John Paul Hammersmith. And the reason was at that time, and I think it still is, that the tradition, if not the rule, is that when there's an appointment in a particular state or jurisdiction, the president, in making an appointment, looks to the senior politician, senator or congressman that's of his own party in that state. Well, when my appointment came up for consideration, when I was being considered, the president was Bush, a Republican, but both our senators, Bumpers and Pryor, were Democrats. And John Paul Hammersmith was the lone, I believe he was the lone Republican at that time. He was the Republican, certainly from this district. And he told me one time, he said, I will make the recommendation. He said, I wouldn't want to appoint or recommend somebody that Bumpers and Pryor didn't approve of. And so he recommended me, and they did not oppose me, and they were both kind enough to support my appointment. And so I would say that my early leanings in politics were Democrat because all my people had been Democrats since the Civil War. That was, you just were a Democrat because of the Reconstruction issues and so forth. It was my parents were both Democrats. I think my father was probably disappointed that I was appointed by a Republican because he was such a strong Democrat. But anyway, I have this theory about that, and I wasn't necessarily thinking about this interview when this came to my mind this morning, but it did come to my mind. John Kennedy once said, famously, ask not what your country could do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And I got to thinking about that this morning and what's going on today in this day and time. And I really think the saying that we ought to be focusing on goes something like this. Ask not what the government can do for you in terms of power and authority and responsibility. Ask what the government, don't ask what the government can do. Don't ask what the government can do for you, but ask what can the government do pursuant to the powers and authority that you give to it. Now, I didn't say that like I meant to say it. As a matter of fact, I wrote that down. I'd rather read it because I had it correct this morning and I've slept since then. But this is how my saying would go. I call it ask not. Ask not what rights, powers, and authority the government grants to you. Ask what rights, powers, and authority you grant to the government. Many people nowadays seem to think, well, we don't have a right to speak, we don't have a right to carry a gun, we don't have a right to decide whether we take a shot or not. The government decides that for us. They have the power, authority to do that. Well, that's not correct if you think about it. The Constitution, as drawn up by the founders, is a creative document. It creates a government that's to work for us. It's to guarantee and protect these God-given rights that the founders thought, and I believe that we have. So it's a limiting document. The Constitution really doesn't give anybody anything. It gives power to the government from the people, but it doesn't give you constitutional rights. The period you already have those rights. So I'm getting off on the lecture here, and I don't mean to, but my point is I think we all need to keep that in mind, and I tried to keep that in mind in my public service, whether it was the time I was thinking about I was a Democrat or I was a Republican, that this government is the servant of the people. It needs to serve us, and we don't need to be servants of the government. I was a public servant, but I was a public servant of the people. I wasn't there to serve the government. A big part of a federal judge's duty is to determine whether what is being done to a citizen is authorized by the Constitution to be done to that citizen by the government. And that's a very weighty task, I always thought, and I still do.
Well, talk about your brother and how he got involved in politics, and maybe if you were involved at all, or...
Well, I like to think he just had a bad day.
Huh?
I was just kidding. I said I like to think he just had a bad day when he decided to get in politics. Kim, as I recall, started, I think, in around 1977 or 78, and I don't know that it had anything to do with what was happening to me at that time, but it might have. At that time, Ted Coxey was the Chancery and Probate Judge here in Benton, Carroll, and Madison counties, and he did step down when he became 70 because he would have lost some of his retirement benefits had he not. So I served out the unexpired part of his term in 1977 and 78 pursuant to an appointment by Governor David Pryor at that time. And Kim, I believe, started his service. He ran for the state legislature, I believe, at that time, and then ultimately served in the Senate. And I think he served around 35, 40 years. He spent a long time down there. And I think it was about 1977 or 78 that he started. And after I had served that time, I was out practicing law until 1992. It's about... oh gosh, how long would that be? From 78 to 92, about
14 years.
Yeah. So during that time, he was active in politics. Yeah. Campaigning, I never wasn't campaigning or anything. I just was appointed and did my service. So.
We'll talk about the Hendren and Hutchison ties. What were they? And talk about how the two families had connections and ties.
Well, the Hutchison family, patriarchs, I guess you could call them, were John Malcolm Hutchison Sr. and Carl Mount Hutchison. I believe her maiden name was Mount. And they were wonderful people. I worked Kim and I both worked a lot for John when he first came here. He came here from Ada, Oklahoma, as I recall, and bought a farm out south of Gravette, and that's where the Hutchinson family lived when we were growing up. And they had a total of, I believe, 6 children, and I believe all of them are still living. The eldest is Rita, and she lives in Oklahoma. And the next eldest is Mary Lee, and she is married to my brother Kim. And the third child is John Malcolm Hutchinson Jr., and John is a retired realtor here, lives in Bella Vista with his wife Betty Sue, who's also a friend of mine. The fourth child, I should say, no, I'm wrong about that. There's Rita and Mary Lee, and then there's John, and the fourth child is Jerry Jean, a young lady who she lives in Springdale now. And then the fifth child is young Timothy Hutchinson, who later became U.S. Senator. He'd been a state assemblyman in the House legislature, and then he ran for Congress, and then he was elected senator. And the next son was William Asa Hutchinson, who's running for president now, and he's the youngest son, and they're all still living. I saw a good picture of them not too long ago, and they were great people. John raised chickens, and he did custom hay baling and farming, and then he later ended up being a chicken inspector for the Tyson people, I believe. So the connection is that Kim fell in love with Mary Lee, I think, in the 5th grade. They were in the 5th grade together, and as far as I know, they never dated anybody else. And they were just locked in lockstep from about the 5th grade on. And so that gave rise to the rumor that we are somehow related. Well, we're not. Kim is related by law, and so he is a brother-in-law to Asa and Tim and all the others, but I'm not. I had a lot of connection with him because I worked for Mr. Hutchinson Sr., but growing up, Kim many times wanted to go over to visit Mary Lee, but it was complicated by her little brothers, Timmy and Asa, who always wanted to kind of be where she was. So he bribed me. He paid me 50 cents to take a ball cap and a ball glove and a bat and go over and play ball with Tim and Asa to kind of keep them away from the courting. So it's been a long association for, 60, 70 years.
You talked earlier about how your politics had changed a little bit from being friends with bumpers and prior and later being more conservative. Talk about how the county changed, and Benton County changed before the rest of the state did in voting. And why did that happen? Do you recall why the Benton County was the first county to switch in the state?
I don't know, Scott. I can surmise, I can speculate as to why that might be. But one of the reasons, I think, may be the fact that the development here in Benton County has been different, I think, than it has in other parts of the state. One example of that is the advent of the Cooper communities, Bella Vista retirement community out here. When that first came about, I was working with the law firm of Little and Enfield, and one of the tasks that I had was examining abstracts on properties that the Cooper people were buying up to build this retirement community, because I just had a course in property law and probably knew as much about it as I ever would at that time, examining land titles. And so I did a lot of that, and I was amazed at the time at what John A. Cooper Sr. was talking about doing out here. He's going to build $1 million clubhouse. He's buying all this land out here that was too poor to even raise a goat. You couldn't do anything with it. He couldn't farm it. It was beautiful and that. But he was a visionary, and he was buying property for, I don't know, maybe $175, $200 an acre, something like that. Now they're selling it for like, $50,000 an acre, or maybe more. But at any rate, that caused some consternation with the local folks here because you had an influx of a lot of Yankees coming down here from Nebraska and South Dakota and all these places coming here to retire in Bella Vista. And they brought in a different mindset. They didn't have a post-Civil War view that was similar to what was here, the aftermath of the Reconstruction, that sort of thing. So a lot of folks came in here that were not Democrats. They were Republicans from up north. They were Yankees and a little bit resented by the local folks. Now, I didn't ever feel that way. I felt like these people coming in here were good for our area because they brought a lot of clean money into northwest Arkansas. By that I mean most of them had had a big farm or a business up in Kansas or Nebraska or whatever. When they sold that, they brought money in here and put it in our banks, and they hadn't borrowed it any place. They didn't have to pay it back. It was clean money coming in, and they promoted a growth that otherwise I don't think would have happened. I think that's one reason. Also, I think that it became more cosmopolitan. I think when Walmart took off in Tysons and so forth, it changed. Made this place noticeable, made it more perhaps attractive to other folks. One problem that with the influx of all these folks that came in here to retire and so forth, you had too many chiefs and not enough Indians. And that caused problems because if you backtrack these folks that came in here, they were the leaders and the movers and shakers in their communities up north. They'd been on the city council, they'd been in city government. So when they come down here, everybody knew how to run things, and sometimes they had a little trouble getting in the same focus, But I think that's one of the reasons why Cooper Communities comes to mind because of the people they brought in and the way they changed the businesses around here. Real estate boomed. It's also the chicken industry, of course, focused here in northwest Arkansas. Kim and I both worked for Lloyd Peterson over at Gravette whenever he was producing the Peterson male, the male chicken. I don't know if you know this, but at one time, I think more than 90% of the chickens on this planet were descended from that Peterson male. It was a breeding phenomenon, and they flew birds out of here all over the country and all over the world. And he was a real pioneer, and then of course Don Tyson, the Tyson family. So the impact of the chicken industry I don't think can be downplayed. And then finally, of course, Walmart. That's an amazing impact. The Walton family and Sam and his family, they could have put that company in the headquarters anywhere they wanted to in the world, certainly in the United States. And I think it's tremendously fortuitous that they have chosen to focus here and stay in Bentonville. I'm sure they've had opportunities to move Walmart headquarters to Dallas or other places, but I really think that well, I don't know why they didn't, but I kind of think that Sam and Helen and the family feel like that northwest Arkansas is a pretty special place, and that Arkansas is a pretty special place. And I think they've helped make it that way by keeping their focus and interest here. And they could have spent their money a lot of different places, and they've chosen to do it here, and I really appreciate that.
Tell me the story about how you started calling Mr. Walton Mr. Sam.
Well, I first met him in 1965, and I'd graduated from law school and studied for the bar. And I was working during that time with the law firm of Little and Enfield, which was comprised of W.H. Enfield and Clayton N. Little as the partners, and they had an associate by the name of Ernest G. Lawrence Jr. And Ernie later became the mayor of Bentonville. He's been gone several years now, but outstanding gentleman and outstanding lawyer. So they gave me work while I was studying for the bar and prior to my going on to active duty with the Navy. And it was during that time that I became acquainted with Sam Walton. He, I believe, had 3 stores at that time, and Walmart was in its infancy. I think it had been set up by that time, and I'm not real sure about that, but he liked to play tennis, and he was pretty good at it, very good at it. And so he learned that I played, and so we started playing. And I know why he liked to play with me, because I bet he beat me 50 sets before I ever won one. And I got better over time, and we finally got where I could play with him and competitively. But during that time, and that went on for over 20 years, up until he shortly before he died. And so we spent a lot of time on the tennis court. And it was awkward for me to start with, because Sam was 25 years older than me, about 25 years. I was raised and taught to believe that you addressed an older person as Mr. So-and-so and didn't get familiar. And so that was my practice. And whenever I would be around him, when I addressed him, I would call him Mr. Walton. And one time we were playing tennis, and he made a good shot, and I said something to the effect, and I shot Mr. Walton, and he stopped playing and walked up to the net and said, why don't you just call me Sam? So I sure would appreciate if you just called me Sam. And so I said okay, but I couldn't do it. I could do it on the tennis court. I finally got where I could call him Sam, but I couldn't do that in public. To me, he was always Mr. Sam or Mr. Walton, and his employees, they had the same problem. I don't think very many of them, other than very close friends who had known him a long time, they called him Mr. Sam too. Some of them, like Phil Lair, and I'm sure did. Bob Bogle, I think, called him Sam, but he was Mr. Sam. He commanded that kind of respect, and not by anything he said, but he was just a person that you respected.
When I interviewed Congressman Womack, he told me a story about how you introduced him to Mr. Sam. Do you remember that?
Well, vaguely.
He said it was at 6:30 in the morning.
Well, that's not uncommon. As a matter of fact, that's a little bit late, but that was early for the congressman. Yeah, I don't have a clear memory of that circumstance right now, but I will tell you this, that he was habitual for going to work very early. Sam was. And there came a time after we'd played tennis for a long time where he said to me one day, you know, it's a shame, but we don't have a picture of us playing tennis together. And I said, well, right. And so he said, well, I'll have Helen come up and make some pictures. And so she did. And I had I call it a brownie camera. I don't know what it was. It wasn't like what you have here. Well, she made some shots, but they weren't very good. Cut our heads off. You know, they weren't good pictures. So we still didn't have a picture. So there came a time when we played in a tournament together out here at Bella Vista. And as we finished up a match, we started to exit the court, and Phyllis Brandon was there, the photographer with the Arkansas Democrat Gazette at that time. It was the Gazette at that time. She was right outside the fence, and she had her camera out, and as we walked toward her, we were walking toward the gate, and she just happened to be there. She said, hey guys, could I get a picture? And so we said, sure. So we just stopped, and she shot it. and it was excellent. And she put it in the paper the next day. It was in the Gazette, and it was a good picture. And so I knew her, and I called her and asked her if I could get a copy of it. She said, well, I'll just give you the original. We're digital now, so she sent it to me. I had it blown up to, I think, 16 by 20 or whatever. I've got my copy in there hanging on the wall. And so I inscribed it, to me, Dear Sam, or to Sam, all the thing, and signed. I can't remember just what I said now. And I got it framed. Went to Walmart and got it framed. So I knew he went to work real early. And so I went out there about 5 o'clock to his general offices out here on Walton now. And he was in there by himself. I think he might even had his tennis gear on, I don't remember, but it was about 5 o'clock. And the doors open, I walked in, nobody else there. And I had that with me. And I said, you said, we didn't have a picture of us together, and so here we do. And gave it to him. Well, he looked at it and acted like he really liked it. And so I had an extra copy with me, folded up, rolled up, and I said, I just happened to have another copy. I said, would you mind signing this one for me? I handed it to him, and he took it, but he hesitated, and he said, well, let me think about that. So I said, okay, and I left, and I thought, well, he doesn't want to do it. He was not into signing autographs very much. He didn't trade on being Sam Walton. He didn't. It wasn't his thing. So I got back to the office and told my wife, I don't think he wants to do it. So about a week later, his secretary Loretta called me and said, Sam signed your picture and said it's ready. And he had, and he'd framed it. And so I got the picture signed by Sam Walton. Now, that's why I'm telling you the story. At 5 o'clock, that's when if you really wanted to get him, that's to get him at that time. Another time I went out he had me do a codicil to his will, and I went out there about 5 o'clock because that's when he wasn't busy. And we had to have 2 witnesses. I was a notary, but I said, we're going to have 2 witnesses. And he said, well, we'll find something. We walked all around through that headquarters. There wasn't anybody else there. And I said, well, why don't you just come down to the office at 8 o'clock? I have a couple of secretaries there, and we can do it there. And he said, no, we'll do it. So we got in his old pickup, and we went to the local donut shop about 5:30 in the morning. And he went in and bought a round of donuts and coffee for everybody in there, and he knew everybody in there. And we invited 2 people, asked them if they would come over here and help him witness his will. And they did. And he signed that codicil, and those 2 people witnessed there in the donut shop. So, back to Congressman Womack's story. I don't have a clear memory of that, but I'm sure that's exactly what happened. That would be the time that we'd have gone out to see him.
Before we go on, I want to go back to, we're talking about politics and the Hutchisons. How big was that race, Tim's first race for state rep and him winning? And talk about that race and how big of a deal that was in the...
Well, actually, Scott, I don't know.
You don't?
I wasn't involved in it.
Okay.
I just knew that he ran, and frankly, I don't recall who ran at the time. I really don't.
That's okay if you're not.
Tim has a good personality, and he did ran a good race, but I don't.
You weren't involved in it, really?
No. Like I said, I wasn't really a politician.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the growth of the county. When you remember what this county looked like when you were a kid, and now what it's grown, and later when you were a lawyer, what size it was, and then so talk about how the town grew and the whole county.
I'll start with a story that was told me by Dad, and he had lived it, so he talked about how back whenever he was a boy, and this would have been, he was born in 1903, so this would be around 1910, 1912, somewhere along in there, that they would come from Gravette to Bentonville in a wagon, horse and wagon. It's the only way they had to get around. And when they got to Bentonville, they would go into the downtown square where the square is, and there was a rail fence around the square there. And they would unhitch the team of horses that pulled their wagon that brought them over here and turn them loose inside that enclosure around. And I don't know, I can't recall exactly when that statue was erected. I think maybe 1980, or I can't remember when. But anyway, the horses would be inside that enclosure. And of course, they would drop their defecations and so forth. So it's a lot of manure in that enclosure. And then when they get through with their business, they take their horses out and hitch them up the wagon and go back home. But that's how that square was used at that time. By horse and wagon, how they got from Gravette. So that's about a day trip, over and back and spending time here. When I was growing up, Highway 71 was through there, but there weren't very many paved roads over around Gravette. When I was going to high school over there, I was in the band, and there was one paved street other than Highway 71 going through town. There was one paved street, and we would walk on the dirt road from the school down to that paved street, and we'd march on that, so it was easier to march, that one paved street. Now in Bentonville, when I came in 1965, and my wife had been here, she got here when she's 5, I think, 6, something like that. It was a very small community. It was about 3,500, I think, at that time, she said, when she graduated from high school in 64. And so you knew just about everybody in town. I mean, I did, and I knew virtually all the lawyers in town. There's, I think, about 20 or 25 in the Benton County Bar Association, and we do them all. And whenever Judge Butt would come to town as a chancery judge, he'd come up about once a week from Fayetteville, where he lived, and after he'd do the morning's business, all the lawyers would go with him over to the Townhouse Cafe, which is where that bicycle shop is now, the Fat Tire shop, that building there. And they'd all eat lunch together. And I went when I first got here, and it was rather extraordinary because the judge would be sitting there with the lawyers and me have a case to be tried that afternoon. Well, they'd start talking about the case with the judge sitting right there because he didn't say anything, he just listened. But they'd argue about it. The plaintiff and defendant would be talking about it, and other lawyers would chime in and say, well, now, and they basically just talk it over right there. And I was not used to that. I'd been a military judge, and we didn't do it quite that way. But that's the way. And he never did say anything. But many times they would work out consensus, and many times they'd convince one side or the other, maybe you ought to settle that thing. And so sometimes they would. And so that happened one time whenever I was, it wasn't the same thing, but it's similar. I was chancery judge, and Clayton Little was trying a case in front of me, and he had been a partner and hired me back in the day, but this was in 77 and 78. And he'd hooked on with another lawyer that he'd known for years, Claude Williams Jr. is his name. Claude Williams Jr. was a nice guy. He didn't do much trial work, and he examined a lot of abstracts and represented First Federal Savings and Loan, and he was and chewed gum, and he was just a real nice guy, told a lot of jokes. And well, Clayton Little had the reputation of being a real stud horse in terms of being trial lawyers. He did a lot of trial work, and he was good at it. Claude didn't, and I didn't know him very well. I'd known him, and so anyway, they hooked up with this trial in front of me, this chancery judge, and it was not pretty because Clayton had committed the mistake he'd always warned me against, and you don't ever underestimate your opponent. That's the worst thing you can do. I don't think Clayton had taken Claude very seriously because Claude didn't try a lot of cases. But it's a mistake to think just because somebody doesn't do a lot of trial work that they can't do it. Well, when it started out, I mean, Claude was the plaintiff, and he had his witnesses absolutely lined up. They knew exactly where he was going. They knew the questions he was going to ask. I mean, it was just like clockwork. And every time Clayton would object to something, Claude immediately would meet it. He had a case or something. I mean, it was a workshop on how to try a lawsuit. The guy really knew what he was doing, and he was cleaning Clayton's clock, believe me. He had his exhibits, and he knew exactly. It was a pleasure to watch. And so by the time we got to noon, Claude wasn't quite finished with his case yet, so we took a break for lunch. And as we were walking down the steps of the courthouse, from the second floor down to the first floor there, we're walking together, but Claude got a little bit ahead of us, and Clayton kind of hung back, and he said, "Hey, boss." He called you boss, you know, just one of his habits. He said, "Would you mind giving us a little extra time for lunch?" He said, "I think maybe I ought to think about settling this thing. What do you think?" And I said, "I think that'd be a real good idea." So he and Claude went off to have lunch together, and they came back and told me they had it settled. And that was one of the reasons Clayton was as good a lawyer as he was. He knew, as Kenny Rogers would say, he knew when to hold them and he knew when to fold them. But he just had seen things were not going well. I didn't say a word because I was the decider. I was the judge. I would have decided the issue. I hadn't said anything, but it became obvious to him that Claude knew what he was doing, and he had him by the short hairs, as they say. So he said, "I think it might be a good idea for me to try to settle this. What do you think?" And I said, I think that'd be a good idea. Anyway, they don't practice law like that now. It's different. Is it better? It's a matter of opinion. But I'll certainly say it's different. And there are a lot of very good lawyers, I think, it's by reputation. I don't have very little experience with any of them that are practicing law right now. I know some, but most were not even licensed when I was practicing here. So I can't really say much about that, but they were good lawyers, and there were some that probably weren't as good as others. But the overall community, I think, was sound. We had some very good business people here. We had some good educators here. We had a community spirit. There was such a thing as called Sugar Creek Days that we had for several years here in Bentonville, which celebrated the past, and it was a community thing. And so I miss that. I think the growth and explosion of population and so forth has maybe changed that, as it always does, and whenever small communities gain population and growth. So I miss it, but it was a good time. It was a good place to grow up. It still is, in my view. I was driving around with my wife the other day and just remarked out of the blue, this is such a great place to live. It's beautiful. It's got good people in it. It's got, it's just a good place to be. It really is.
Before we get on to some of the final questions, what are some stories or memories you have maybe that stand out that I haven't asked about, or about Benton County, or maybe some of the people you've met over the years?
I guess the one, I'll preface my response by this. I believe that to a great extent our lives are defined by the people that we have in them, for good or for ill. We're influenced by the people we have in our lives. I felt like I was influenced in a positive way by my mother and my dad, and I've talked a little about my dad, but not much about my mother. My mother was an extraordinary person too, I believe, and I think any son that doesn't want to brag on his parents, you kind of wonder about him anyway, but I don't apologize for bragging about my mother. She was born in 1906, and she went to school at Cottage Grove, one room schoolhouse, but she graduated at Gravette, and she was on track to have graduated with the class of 1925. But when she finished her 10th grade and would have gone, I believe I'm right about that, she'd finished the 10th grade and would have gone into the 11th grade. It happened that there were only 2 members in the prospective class of 1925 at Gravette, and the other was Aline Wagner, a good friend of my mother's. And so, with the consent of both sets of parents, Silas Hunt, who was the superintendent of Gravette at that time, moved Luella Fair and Aline Wagner up to grade 12. And they graduated with the class of 1924. I think there were like 16 or 18 folks in that class. One of them was Stokes Ballard, who was later president of Bank of Gravette. So a lot of really capable people in that class. I'm proud to say, when that class graduated, my mother was a valedictorian of that class. I've been so proud of that. And whenever I was getting ready to graduate, my coach, who happened to be the principal, called me into the office one day, and I thought, what have I done now? You know, as a senior, you get a little bit loose with things. He lectured me how I was not hitting it. He'd been looking over my grades. Now, this is my coach, who happened to be the principal, and he said, you're not working at your study. He says, you're not careful. He said, your good friend Mike Allen is going to be the valedictorian of your class. He said, you'll regret that the rest of your life. He said, you need to buckle down. And when the final grades came out, I was less than 1 grade point higher than Mike. He was a salutatorian. He's a good friend of mine, one of my good friends. He was a Navy fighter pilot in the Vietnam War, 368 missions, and 200 nighttime traps off aircraft carriers. The guy's an incredible warrior, hero. He's still upset about this. Said, I can't believe that. He beat me by 1 point. Now, my mother influenced me, and the coach influenced me. Now, that's what I'm trying to get to and what I'm saying. That's why I feel so blessed that I had a mother who encouraged me and a dad who encouraged me, and I had teachers who encouraged me. That coach was interested in winning football and basketball games, but he was also interested in seeing me succeed academically. And I really treasure that. The other memories I have, like I said, people that you're fortunate to have in your life, is Sam Walton. I felt so blessed to get to know him and to play a lot of tennis with him. You can learn an awful lot about somebody when you play a competitive sport with them. You really can. Because some people get so obsessed with winning that a side comes out that you don't normally see. With Sam Walton, I never lost when I played Sam Walton on the tennis court. I didn't end up with the most points, and I didn't win the games, but I always won because he was such a gentleman. If he won, he was almost apologetic. Well, I caught you on an off day today, you know. He just never rubbed it in, he was just a perfect gentleman. If I won, he was just so complimentary. Boy, you're just too good for me today. You're just so he always made me feel great. Now, don't get me wrong. You had to beat him. He tried to beat you every time you played. You could get ahead of him 40-love, 5-zip, and you still had it to do. You had to beat him. He never would give up. But he was such a gentleman. And sometimes in playing, I'd hit a ball from my end of the court. I could see from my end of the court it was a foot long. He'd stop playing and look for the mark because he'd called it out just to make sure that he had, he wanted to beat you, but he wanted to win fairly. that was a tremendous influence to me. When I was in, I'm talking about influence here in Benton County. I had a lot of influencers when I was in the Navy that were very influential toward me. Clayton Little was an influencer for me too. One of the major influencers for me was Harlan Phillips. Harlan was my father-in-law. He founded the Phillips Food Centers and Food for Less grocery stores in Arkansas. He may have been, I'd say he is, he's the most extraordinary guy I believe I was ever around. I think in many ways he was handicapped. I think he was dyslexic. He had trouble reading. But he was so focused on you, as was Sam Walton. Sam would always want to be interested in you. Who are you? How's things going? What's your family like? Where are you from? He'd always try to remember your name. He would focus on that. And he was very good at remembering your names, but he told me a number of times he had a bad memory. He says, you really have to work at it. Now, I have fancy memory, and I've been encouraged with him about that, and I've tried to work on it, to memorize and keep people's names. Every time I would have a jury trial, I would memorize the names of the members of that jury. And when they'd come back into chambers, I'd invite them back to kind of decompress and answer whatever questions I could for them. I'd always call every one of them by name. And it got to be a real burden because the marshals would tell the jury that's what I was going to do, so I had to do it anyway, whether I wanted to or not. But that makes people feel good if you remember their name, and Sam Walton was good at that, and so was Harlan Phillips. He'd make sure he knew you, he could call you by name. And he did that because he was a merchant, but he did that because he was just a decent human being. And so and there were others. I could give you another guy that comes to my mind is Ed Buck, R.E. Buck. He was the president of the Bank of Bentonville when I first came here to work, and he was so supportive. And I've heard other stories how Mr. Buck had encouraged people, young lawyers that came into town. One of them was Jerry Dawsey. Jerry told me, because we were swapping stories about Ed, Mr. Buck had lent me money to buy a building where I put my practice for a while, and I didn't really have the collateral for it. But here's what he told Jerry Dawsey when he went to borrow money. Mr. Buck said, "How much do you need?" or something to that effect. And Jerry said, "Well, I need X number of dollars, but I really don't have any collateral." And Mr. Buck said, "Well, Jerry, you've got a college education and a law degree, so that's enough collateral for me." And he lent him the money. Now, I'm not sure that the bankers around do things like that anymore. But I will say that this community in Bentonville had a lot of folks who were interested in giving other folks a hand up. And the lawyers were that way. I mean, even when you're an opponent against a lawyer, they help you. One of my stories that I want to tell here, now it may not be what you want to hear, but there was a lawyer here in Bentonville by the name of Eugene Caulfield. He was called Old Cedar Leg because he had lost a leg, and he stumped around with a limp because he had an artificial leg. And Gene tried every case the same way. He was just as mad as he could be, and he just wanted to tear you limb from limb. I mean, he just break out on you like a rash every time, how hard to deal with. And frankly, many of the lawyers maybe didn't think a lot of Gene, and I didn't know what to make of him. I knew it seemed like he was always mad about something. But we had a case early on when I returned from the Navy, and I was practicing by myself, and it was pretty contentious. It was a contested divorce case, and he had the woman client and I had the man client. And so we had crossed swords over several things, and it'd been just like fighting a cockfighting rooster every time you try to deal with Gene. And so it turned out that we had finally reached a settlement and going to get the decree taken. And in the settlement, his client was to pay my attorney's fees as a trade-off on property and so forth. And it was $250, which didn't sound like much, but it was quite a bit to me then. And about the time that we had reached the settlement, you couldn't take the decree for 30 days after you make the settlement. That's what the rule was then. And so my son, our only son, had a heart condition, and he had been diagnosed as having a serious problem that required open heart surgery, and we were taking him to Houston, Texas. Dr. Denny Cooley, a very famous heart surgeon, was going to operate on him. And we didn't know whether he was going to live or die. He was only 9 months old at that time. And I'd just gotten out of the service, and I'd borrowed money to start my practice. I had some good insurance, but it was kind of a tight financial situation. But I had folks that would have helped me. My parents, Harlan, Janet's parents would have helped us. I think Mr. Little, I think several people would have helped me if I'd have needed financial help. But one day, right when we'd settled this case, Gene Caulfield came walking across the street. His office was right across the street from mine. And my wife was my secretary, and I heard him come in. I saw him coming across, and he said, "Well, is he in there?" She said, "Well, yeah," and he just walked right past her and came on in. And I think I stood up. I was sitting behind my desk, and he said, didn't say much. He just came in and said, took a check out of his pocket and just tossed it, spun that on my desk. And I looked at it, and it was his personal check for $250. I said, "Well, what's this? What's that?" He said, "Well, that's your fee in this case." I said, "I don't think you're entitled to it, but I'm going to go ahead and pay it." It's just Gene. I said, "Well, his attorney's fee." I said, "Well, Gene, that's not due for 30 days. He said, "I don't care." He said, "You need that to take care of that boy." And then he took out a blank check that was signed. And he tossed that down, and he said, "And here's another one signed with blank." He said, "My God, there's plenty more where that came from." He said, "You take that and you use it for whatever you need to take care of that boy." You can tell it almost makes me choke up now to think about it. Brought tears to my eyes. That hadn't happened very often in my life. And I never will forget that. I had friends I know would have helped me, but nobody else paid me something that wasn't due yet. Nobody else gave me a signed blank check and said, "You use it for whatever you need." Gene Caulfield did. And he did a lot of things like that he didn't want anybody to know about. He enjoyed that reputation of being, and so thank goodness things worked out great for Jason. I gave him the check back. I said, "Gene, I'm okay. I didn't take the signed check. I did take the $250, and so I didn't need it." And so thank God things worked out. Jason's surgery was successful. He's now a successful lawyer and doing great. But I came back, and the next time I had a case of Gene Caulfield, it was the same way. He just tried to tear my head off. I meet him in court, and he's just mad as he could be about, I never have forgotten that. He did that. But the next time I saw him, it's just like he's going to try to tear me to pieces. But Gene Caulfield, he was a good lawyer, a lot better than most people thought. And as far as I know, he was dead honest. But he'd stand in front of the jury, and he'd hitch up his pants and say, "Are you really trying to tell this jury thus and so?" And the witness would say, "Well, yeah." That's just the way he tried cases. But was he an influencer? Yes. Not necessarily in being an angry lawyer. That's not. I was counterproductive, frankly, for Gene. But that was his personality. But in terms of doing something like that he didn't have to do, to somebody I was nobody to him. I was just a young lawyer starting practice. But he went out of his way on a wooden leg to come across that street and give me something he didn't owe. And that was his personal check. He did to get the money from his client, but that was his personal check. And then to give me a blank check, I'll never have forgotten that. And it encourages me, that you need to care about other people. He did. I could go on because there are other people that I could say nice things about, but those folks that I've mentioned were strongly influenced me. I hope for the good, and that's for somebody else to judge.
If someone came to you who'd never been to Benton County, and they said, Judge, what's Benton County like? What would you tell them?
Well, it's a complicated question. It depends, I think. It depends on a lot of different things. Let me just make a few comments, and then I'll try to give you an answer that I like. It's not original with me, but I think it fits. I think if you have to be honest right now, people coming into Benton County, it's a tough place to live, to find housing, fair housing now, because of that's just a fact. It is. That's a price of, I think, of the growth and progress that we've seen here. I think you would find here now, like places like Crystal Bridges, like the American Indian Museum, you'll find cultural amenities that were not here 40 or 50 years ago. I'm not saying this is New York, thank God it's not, but there are aspects of culture, amenities, and opportunities here now that weren't for a long time. The topography, the streams that we have, the mountains, the topography here is just amazing. If you just look around, most of us when we're driving around, we look and should be looking at the highway and making sure you don't get run over in all this traffic. But if you just look up around, like driving just around in this area, it's beautiful. I mean, it's comparative to the Blue Ridge Mountains in Tennessee and a lot of other places that I've seen. It's just beautiful. You have a lot of clean air here. People don't realize that. I was out walking early this morning. It's pristine, clear, beautiful. So I would say, in that vein, it's got a great school system. I mean, do you even know how many schools there are in Benton County now? I don't. I mean, once upon a time you had a school in Bentonville, a school in Rogers. Now you've got 2 high schools in both Rogers and Bentonville, and I don't know how many elementary schools and secondary schools. So the school system is amazing. You think of quality medical care now. I can remember back in the day, you had to go to Little Rock or Tulsa or Kansas City or to Houston, as we did with Jason, for quality medical care. Now we've got great hospitals here, great hospital systems that we have here. So I would say to people that if you're looking for a community that has all of the great characteristics of a small, close-knit community, but at the same time has many of the advantages, cultural opportunities, and so forth that you find in bigger places. You can't find a better place than Bentonville, Arkansas. You really can't. Now, there's a story about this couple with their family had moved, we were moving, and they were in a car and they came into this small town. We'll say it's in Arkansas. And they stopped in front of a general store, and there's a guy sitting there on the bench talking and spitting and whittling. And they said, "Say, we're strangers here, and we're on the move, and we're thinking about maybe locating here. What kind of town is this? What kind of a town is this to live in?" And one of the guys, kind of the Edgar Buchanan type, he said, "Well, what kind of a town did you come from? What kind of a town was that like? And they said, oh, well, we had to leave there. I said the people were not friendly, and it's hard to get along, and there just wasn't much work and no community spirit, so we just had to get out of there. We just couldn't live there. And the guy said, well, I'm afraid you'll probably find this town to be about like that one too. So they left. Well, by and by comes along another family. Same situation, they're traveling. They say, what kind of town is this? What are the people like? What kind of a place it is to live in? And the spokesman said again, well, what was the town like you came from? And they said, oh, it was wonderful. It had the most wonderful people, great amenities, great people. Everybody was friendly, had a great government, had a great school system. We just hated terribly to leave, and we're hoping we'll find something similar to that where we're going. And the guy said, well, that's the way you'll find things here. Now, ever since I heard that story, I've thought about that a lot of it is attitude, is how you look at it. And if you approach, most places could be good. I've lived in Gravette, lived in Newport, Rhode Island when I was in the service, and I found good things about each place that I lived, but you have to look for them, and it depends on your attitude. Now, having said all that, even if you've got a jaundiced attitude or a good attitude, either way, you're going to find Bentonville, Arkansas is a good place to live, but you got to give it a chance. And when you come here to Bentonville, Arkansas, if you come with a chip on your shoulder, that you feel that you're being harassed or discriminated against or whatever, you probably can find that here. If you look hard enough, you can find it. But if you come here and you have a positive attitude, you're going to find that in spades. So I don't know that I've answered your question, but I think all the ingredients for a wonderful place to live are here. But the people in this community, you have to look for them, and you have to buy into that, so to speak.
Very good. Last question here, and then we can do some work. If you had to keep this short and simple, how would you say it? My favorite thing about Benton County is, like, restate it. My favorite thing about it.
My favorite thing about Benton County is the fact that I was blessed to have been born and raised here by the families, two families, the Hendren family and the Fair family, my people, patriarchal and matriarchal families, that I had the good fortune to be born here, and that circumstances in this county have progressed over time that made it possible for me to stay here. Because whenever I was born back in the day, there weren't very many things to do here unless your daddy owned a big farm or a business or something like that. You had to go to Kansas City or Tulsa, someplace, to make a living. There just wasn't anything to do here. And thank goodness now there is, and that's a tribute, I think, to the people who basically populated this state from 1836 when it became a state, and they've built upon that, and they have retained the best, and they've muted, we'll say, some of the worst things that you see here. So the best thing about it, I think, is that I'll steal a little line from Sam Walton. He said one time, you've got to know how to adapt. You've got to know how to adapt. And I think that this county has shown they can adapt. They have received newcomers from other places that come in here in Bella Vista and so forth. They've absorbed different people. When I grew up here, there were nobody here basically but white folks. Now we have quite a diversity here, And I think the community is adapting to that, and some don't. But I guess that's how I would sum it up. My favorite thing about Benton County is its capability and ability to adapt.
Anything else?
Wish the walls could talk. Captain Hendren, I'll tell you a quick story about that. I don't know if your thing's on, it doesn't matter, but this cabin, this house, it's a log house because it's not just a cabin, it's 2-story, was built, as near as I can figure, in 1968, and here's the story behind that. My dad was a fine man, but he was not really sentimental, I guess you could say. So he never said very much to me about it until after he got where he wasn't working, he was my age or older. I asked him one time if I could have that feed box that's in there. You may have seen it there. But when we were growing up, that feed box sat about right there where you are. And this was open. And that feed box we used to put cattle feed in, 16% dairy and cottonseed meal and dill run and stuff like that. And so we'd come through that opening and open up that thing and get a coffee can, get a bucket of food and put it in the manger for the old cows to eat there. And throw that coffee cup in there, slam it down, go back out, go around there, milk the cows. Teenage boys. And so I was built in this other cabin down here, which is the Ellis Fair cabin. It was built in 1858. And I asked Dad one day, I said, that old feed box, that I'd like to have that to go in this cabin down here. And Dad said, in typical Nick Hendren fashion, well, you know what that is, don't you? And I said, well, it's a feed box that we used to feed the cattle out of. He said, well, that was my mother's meal chest. And I said, now, what? And he said, that's my mother's meal chest. She had 15 children, and 12 of them lived to majority, and 8 of them lived into their 80s. He was the last one to die. And they were poor, really poor. But he said, no matter how bad things were, she could always find enough flour or cornmeal in that meal chest to cook biscuits or cornbread to feed her family. And I said, well, Dad, why in the world were you letting us use that as a cattle feed box? He knew what I was talking about. Can you imagine? I mean, that's an artifact. My grandmother raised my dad and 11 other children, feeding them out of that box, and he was letting 2 teenage boys use it to feed cattle and misusing it. I mean, lucky we didn't tear it up. So I had a guy repair it and fix it. So I was just astonished at that. And then he said, about this cabin, this is the first time he ever told me that. And I was in my 40s at that time. And he said, now, that log house there, you know what that is, don't you? And I said, well, hey, Janet, come in.
Hi.
Come in.
Hi.
He said, again, you know what? I said, well, that's the barn we raised. And he said, no. He said, Captain Hendren, that's Captain Hendren right there, built that for one of his nieces right after the Civil War in 1868. And he said, here's the story. They were building it on a place just across the road from where I grew up, on property that my dad owned back in 1868. And Captain Hendren lived on the other side of Gravette, well, about a mile, 2-3 miles over there. And so while the workmen were building this cabin, Grandpa Hendren, E.L. Hendren, that's him up there, and this is him on this horse here. he was sent over with a cold jug of buttermilk to take to his daddy, Captain Hendren, that was helping build this house, and the workmen. Well, he was playing what he was doing on a flat rock run of spring, and he slipped and fell and broke the jug. Got in big trouble because Daddy didn't have any buttermilk and he broke his mother's jug. And my grandfather, E.L. Hendren, was born in 1859. And so Dad said he was 9 years old when that happened. And so that's how I figure this was built in 1868. But that's the story. And these guns here, you see those guns? They belong to Captain Hendren, and he carried those at the Battle of Pea Ridge and Battle of Prairie Grove and Wagon Creek. Yeah.
I'll be back.
Okay. We're about through with it. And so, anyway, I got those. Well, anyway, the story was when Dad told me that, I thought, man, I never knew that, but I want to preserve that. So when Dad died, he had 3 tracts of land, and he said one to Julian, one to Kim, and one to me, and I ended up with this one where this one was. And then Kim, he wanted to buy it because we live here, and I didn't feel like I needed any property in Gravette. So I said, well, I'll sell you that tract, but I want that log house out of it. So we had to tear the barn down to get it out. We tore it down, and we took these logs down and labeled them. And he hauled them over here. He had a lowboy. He has a bulldozer, and he carried these logs over here on his lowboy, and we reconstructed them here. So back in the day, people got born here. They got married here, and when they died, they were laid out here and buried. The girl that this house was built for was buried in a graveyard that's right next to where this house was built. The gravestone's still over there. So that's, I think, kind of an interesting history. All those years, I spent every morning and night, we were milking cows in this structure here. We hauled hay and stacked it. He never said a word about that. I don't know that he'd have probably died without ever telling anybody that if I hadn't asked him about that box in there. And so that's how I ended up with it. So I love this place. I love to be out here. It evokes so many memories. You see that picture on top? Can't make much of it, but that is a house in which Grandpa Hendren was living when my father was born. Now, he's not in that picture. So that picture is in the 1903 Atlas of Benton County. And so my dad, he was born in October of 03. So I think Grandma Hendren might have been pregnant with my dad when that picture was made. I don't know for sure, but I think so.